Hello, and today we're reviewing the SKIL RS582802 12v compact brushless reciprocating saw. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot. Now the battery slot in this particular tool is going to be a fairly typical design. It's located on the rear of the tool and will accept any of SKIL's 12-volt lithium batteries. And quite frankly, it works just fine with pretty much any battery I've tried it with. This particular tool, if you buy it in a kit will come with a 2 amp hour battery, and that's going to be more than enough to power the tool. The battery will lock into place nice and securely, and I haven't had any sorts of issues with loss of power going to the motor or the battery falling out, so everything is pretty normal there. I will say there is a little bit of looseness or play to speak of, but there isn't enough to make me concerned, and it still is a fairly good showing, so it still gets a pass in that regard. Now when it comes to what size battery you should use with this particular tool, the included 2 amp hour battery, if you purchase it as a kit, is adequate. But if you are looking for a little bit more power and a longer run time, a 4 amp hour battery might be a good idea, but not necessarily required, because the 2 amp hour battery should get you through your light duty pruning jobs or your small construction projects. And it's going to be just adequate enough, but you will probably burn through it fairly quickly, so at least having a second battery might be a good idea. But with that being said, everything here is a pretty normal showing, and I don't really have any major complaints, so let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the grip. Now, the grip on this particular tool is going to be perfectly satisfactory for people who have small to medium-sized hands, and if you have larger hands, it should still be a fairly easy tool for you to use. Now, I definitely think that they did an excellent job with putting rubberized texture everywhere that you might want rubberized texture. They did not skip out on the rubberized texture, and it definitely seems to be a little bit higher grade than what Ryobi typically uses, and I don't really have any complaints about how long I think that this rubberized texture is going to last. On some Ryobi tools, sometimes it can come off fairly easily, although it's not always the case. It just kind of depends on the model on Ryobi. But with this particular saw, they did an excellent job with putting rubberized texture anywhere your hands might go, on the underneath on the front, on the top on the front, and where your hand sits next to the trigger. There's plenty of contours and grooves and ridges and dips that help you maintain your grip on this particular tool, even in challenging circumstances, like when your hands are wet or if you're wearing gloves. And so, quite frankly, I don't really have any complaints about the overall ergonomic design of this particular tool or the materials they used on it. It's fairly well balanced and fairly lightweight, so as it goes for a one-handed reciprocating saw, it's a fairly comfortable tool to use. So no complaints here, and everything passes with flying colors. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety. Now the trigger on this particular reciprocating saw is a single finger variable speed trigger that is made out of a smooth black plastic. There are basically 5 speeds for you to choose from on this variable speed trigger, and it's a fairly typical showing. It does have a nice super slow speed, but unfortunately the next speed is quite a bit faster, and so it's not going to be the best tool for your more delicate cuts or maneuvers. Quite frankly, I would have liked to have seen a little bit better definition in between the, well, second slowest speed and the slowest speed, but it's, well, acceptable enough. And at least we still got a very slow speed, which is more than what I can say about certain reciprocating saws I've tried in the past. So other than that, everything is a pretty typical show. It does take the saw a few moments to get up to its full speed because of the 12-volt system or 12-volt batteries that this particular saw uses. So just keep that in mind before you start your cut, and just know that this isn't going to be nearly as responsive as an 18 or 20-volt system. So just keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to the safety is a fairly good showing. It's also made out of black plastic and is located directly above the trigger, and it's going to be a simple push button style. When you push the button all the way to the right, the safety has been engaged, and when you push it all the way to the left, the safety has been disengaged and you will be able to pull the trigger. Now when the safety is engaged, the light will not turn on, so it's a fairly well designed safety, and I don't really have any complaints about it in use. So with that being said, the only minor complaint I have about the trigger safety system would be the fact that there isn't really a second or super slow speed, and other than that, everything here is, well, completely satisfactory. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the blade clamp. Now the blade clamp on this particular reciprocating saw is of the style I like, but unfortunately it's not the most expensive of the style I like, meaning that you will have to twist the blade clamp open each and every time you want to insert a blade. It does not stay locked open, unfortunately. But still, I do prefer this particular style versus the style that has the lever on the side of the tool, because in my experience what happens a lot of time is the rod that holds the blade clamp will become bent, meaning that, well, things don't line up properly, and the tabs on the inside on the rod and on the lever will become misaligned, which makes it basically impossible to change your blade out until you, well, bend the rod back into the proper position. But with this particular design, you always have access to the, well, blade clamp even if the rod does become bent, so it's a better design. And when it comes to blade retention, I haven't had any issues with this particular tool dropping blades or blades falling out, so as far as I'm concerned, the blade clamp on this particular tool is completely adequate. Moving on. Okay, next up we have an LED light. Now this LED light is located in front of the front grip, and it's going to be very useful if you're working in a dark environment and you have no other light sources. This light isn't really all that bright, but at the end of the day I am glad that they included it, and it's still better than not having any light whatsoever. And I've owned reciprocating saws that are far more expensive. They don't have a LED light on them at all, so I will gladly take this over nothing because, well, a little bit of light is better than no light. And, well, when it comes to the quality of this particular light, it's got a fairly cool color temperature, and it's going to be able to illuminate things, you know, a foot or two in front of the tool. So if you do end up dropping something and you don't have any other light source, it still is going to be useful for seeing what you dropped and being able to pick that object up again. The light itself will become activated when the trigger is pulled, although you don't actually have to pull the trigger hard enough for the motor to become activated for the light to turn on. If you have the safety engaged, the light will not turn on, so make sure you always have the safety off if you're trying to use the light. And once you release the trigger, the light will stay illuminated for around 10 seconds, meaning it has an afterglow function. And that's about it. It's going to be a useful light in certain situations, but I still would definitely pack an extra work light if you're working in a dark environment. Okay, next up we have the shoe, and it's an okay performance here. Now, the shoe in this particular reciprocating saw is made out of a metal that has been painted black, and unfortunately it will lose paint fairly quickly. The depth of the shoe is also not adjustable, and it only has a minimum amount of pivoting range on the front, and it's fairly stiff until you break it in. So it's a pretty standard design here. I really wish that we would have gotten some depth adjustability here, because that really can save you money on the cost of reciprocating saw blades when you can adjust the depth of the, well, shoe, but unfortunately we did not get that with this particular tool, so that is a little bit of a disappointment. But as it stands, it's still a completely adequate shoe for this particular tool, and it gets the job done, even if it doesn't do it as well as, say, other reciprocating saws on the market. So the shoe is adequate enough. It loses paint quickly, it's non-depth adjustable, and it's not removable, so it's just a fairly, well, basic option. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on to the weight of the tool. Okay, without a battery, but with a blade, it weighs 1,496 grams, which is about 3.3 pounds. And with a 2 amp hour battery, it weighs 1,761 grams, which is about 3.8 pounds. So it's a very lightweight tool. Okay, let's talk a little bit about this particular saw in use. I have to say, it wasn't a half bad experience. I really was expecting it to perform worse than it actually did, and I was pleasantly surprised by just how well it did. In fact, in a lot of different scenarios, it tied or ended up coming within striking distance of my Ryobi one-handed reciprocating saw. About the only time the Ryobi really pulled ahead was when I needed to use a lower TPI count blade that had larger teeth, say a large pruning blade. The Ryobi was able to handle that a bit better because of the 18-volt battery versus the SKIL with the smaller 12-volt battery. But in most other scenarios, the SKIL was able to keep up pretty effectively. So I really wouldn't lose too much sleep if you were debating whether to buy this or the Ryobi. And if you are bought into, say, the SKIL lineup, I don't think there's any reason to have to go out and buy a better one-handed reciprocating saw versus this one, unless you have a particular scenario where you need a different, well, one-handed reciprocating saw, which would pretty much only be if you need a smaller one. This particular reciprocating saw is actually fairly comparable to the size of my Ryobi. It is lighter weight than the Ryobi, which means it's a little bit better to use on a ladder. But unfortunately, the Ryobi really isn't that much, bigger that it makes that big of a difference in a lot of different situations when it comes to just the one-handed nature of the tool. I will say the one area on this particular tool I really am missing some features on will be the fact that there is no belt clip or wrist strap point on this particular saw. Being on top of a ladder means that there's only so many places you can set a tool, and there's a lot of times where you just don't want to risk having your tool fall and get damaged by a long drop to the ground. And the fact that there's no wrist strap point or belt clip on this particular tool is a bit of a negative. So this is an area of the tool that I really hope that they improve upon in the future on future models. Now, the other area on this particular tool that probably could use with some improvement would be the blade clamp. Now, don't get me wrong, the blade clamp system on this is better than the blade clamp system on my Ryobi, but I really wish that they had spent the extra few, quarters and went with the always open system, where once you take a blade out, it remains open, so you can quickly insert another blade without having to twist the clamp. But unfortunately, we did not get that, and you will have to twist the clamp every single time you want to insert a blade. So that's another area that could use some improvement. But other than that, this has been a fairly good little reciprocating saw, and I don't really have any major negatives about it in most situations. Just remember to always go with a higher TPI count when you are selecting a blade for this particular tool, and you should be fairly safe in most situations. So with that being said, let's go ahead and recap with the pros and cons. And the first pro would be size. This is a fairly compact saw, which means that it's going to be a fairly useful tool for when you're working in tight spaces or up on top of ladders. So in my opinion, this is a pro. And next up, we have brushless. The brushless motor is going to allow you to have a longer motor life, a little bit more battery efficiency, and more torque than what you typically get from a brushed motor. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Grip. Overall, I really do like the grip on this particular tool. I think they did an excellent job with the overall contours and grip design here, and the rubberized texture is of a high quality. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Blade clamp. The blade clamp being directly accessible on top of the drive shaft is definitely superior to, well, the lever style blade change system. So in my opinion, this is a pro. Price. Overall, the price for this reciprocating saw is about $60 tool only, and sometimes you can find it with a battery at $60. So the price is very affordable for a one-handed brushless reciprocating saw, and thus a pro in my opinion. And the first meh would be power. Overall, the runtime with this particular saw isn't going to be the best with 2 amp hour batteries, and 12 volts just isn't a whole lot of power, but it's definitely enough to get the job done, but it's just not enough to be a great experience. Just kind of meh, to be honest. So in my opinion, the power level is just meh. And the first con is no belt clip or wrist mount. Not having a belt clip or wrist mount on this particular tool is a little bit of a downside, and it would definitely be helpful for when you were working on top of ladders. So in my opinion, this is a con. And the next con would be the shoe. The paint scrapes off easily, it's not depth adjustable, and overall the pivoting angle isn't going to be the greatest. So in my opinion, it's just kind of a little bit of a con. Warm up. Overall, it takes the saw a few moments to get up to full speed, and it is noticeable if you're coming from an 18 or 20 volt system. It's not that big of a deal, and if you are used to working with 12 volt tools, you probably won't even notice it. But if you are coming down from a more powerful tool, it is noticeable. And the next con is the cost of batteries. Unfortunately, SKIL batteries are a little bit overpriced in my opinion. They're not super overpriced, but at the same time, you can get pretty much the same equivalent battery in a 20 volt system for about the same price. So in my opinion, there is a little bit of a con here, and I hope that they do something in the future to lower the cost of their batteries. And the last con would be the second speed. Going from the slow speed to the second slow speed is quite the jump, and I personally would like to see a little bit more of a ramp rather than a giant cliff face there. So quite frankly, this is an area of the tool that could use a little bit of an improvement. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular reciprocating saw. I have to say I'm actually quite surprised by how well the saw did against my one-handed Ryobi reciprocating saw, and it was able to keep up very effectively even though it only was running with 12 volts. Now, that's not to say that this is going to be the best option on the market for the majority of people. I think that if you're not bought into any tool system and you don't mind a little bit extra weight, going with a larger 18 or 20 volt one-handed reciprocating saw or even a 24 volt one-handed reciprocating saw is going to be the better option. But if you are in the SKIL lineup and you are looking for a one-hand reciprocating saw, this really is your only option without, buying into another tool lineup. And I don't think you should lose any sleep over this particular saw if you do end up purchasing it. I don't think it's going to be the most compact 12 volt reciprocating saw on the market, but for what it is, it's definitely a very good saw, and I don't have any hesitations about picking the saw up and using it out in the yard at any time. So quite frankly, this little saw comes recommended if you're in the SKIL 12-volt system and need a one-handed reciprocating saw. So yep, it comes recommended. And that is it for this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we will see you next time. God bless.